All right, it's time now for Focus here on France 24. Today, it's the day that many people in the United States and in Cuba thought they would never see. As of midnight local time last night, the two countries now have full embassies reinstated on each other's territories. It's one of the biggest steps in the historic thawing of relations between Havana and Washington after more than half a century as sworn enemies. The announcement back in December was widely celebrated around the world, but many people are fearful of how it might impact their lives. Our correspondents in Miami take us to meet Cuban-Americans to find out why, from established dual citizens to those fresh off the migrant boats.
These are brand new T-shirts, and they're for us.
Clean T-shirts, new shoes, symbols of a fresh life for these Cuban refugees. In Miami, a non-profit gives them the basic necessities to rebuild their lives.
We have telephone cards if you want to call Cuba.
24 hours ago, these men thought they would die at sea. They fled from Cuba aboard a makeshift boat, and it took them 3 days to reach the U.S.
This is the boat on which we left. We were 7 aboard. We crossed hundreds of kilometers. There were thunderstorms and sharks everywhere. It was madness, but we didn't have the choice. We want a better life.
Thanks to a 1966 law, Cuban immigrants who reach American soil can receive residency status. With the reestablishment of diplomatic relations, many fear the end of this privilege.
Before leaving, we heard rumors saying that on July 20th, the law would stop, and all those embarking on sea trying to reach the US would immediately be sent back to Cuba.
In the last 6 months, nearly 19,000 Cubans have entered the U.S. This is double from the same stretch of time last year. At the U.S. Border Patrol, they're trying to dispel rumors about new rules.
If we apprehend Cubans, our posture has not changed. We still take those individuals into custody, and we process them in accordance with current regulations and current laws that have not changed at all.
A State Department official told us that there were no plans to change Cuban immigration policy. That position may ease some of the anger toward President Obama's policy. In Miami, where 60% of Cuban immigrants live, the anti-Castro voices are fierce and used to getting hurt.
The opening of an embassy doesn't mean nothing. And the people of Cuba will still, under the misery, terrorism of a state, and slavery.
The position of Obama simply gives oxygen to the dictatorship.
It's a viewpoint echoed by Republican candidates for president, like Senator Marco Rubio, whose parents are Cuban immigrants, and former Florida Governor Jeb Bush.
But we don't need a glorified tourist to go to Havana in support of a failed Cuba.
But for some more moderate Cubans, the opening of embassies makes it easier for families to reunite. Since December, this travel agency in Miami has seen a 15% increase in bookings to Cuba.
It takes between 30 and 45 days for the visa. When do you want to leave?
As soon as it's ready.
For Cuban immigrants, getting a visa remains subject to a special authorization by the Cuban government. But the opening of embassies is easing fears. Born in Havana, this customer left the island when she was 6 years old. For the first time, she's preparing to return.
Well, now I'm not so afraid to try it. Now I don't want to get stuck there. You know, I left there once as an immigrant. I don't want to get stuck there again. So now I feel like I'm going with the permission and the blessings of the American government.
Even with the changes, the impact on Cuban Americans remains limited, especially when it comes to business. One group representing Cuban exiles described a discouraging meeting with Havana's Washington delegation.
The chief of the disinterest told the Cuban-American investors, who of you have $10, $50 million to invest in Cuba? You don't have it? We are not interested. So they are not interested in petty cash. The Cuban government is not interested in Cuban-Americans.
Returning the U.S. flag over an Havana embassy will be an historic moment for Obama's presidency. As for the 55-year-old trade embargo, only Congress can lift that.
That report from Jan Schreiber and Doug Hanks. Are all these fears we heard in that report then, are they warranted? We can bring in our guest, Pascal Drouot. Hello there. A Latin American specialist at the Choiseul Institute. Now, Mr. Drouot, first off, we heard from some Cuban-Americans in that report predicting bad times ahead for Cuba out of this thawing of relations. Speaking of dictatorship, of slavery, what do you see in Cuba's future?
Well, I think that today we are in a symbolic gesture being based on political position. A political position on a specific moment inside Latin America, but also with the international relations, where the enemy of the US, also from the Europe, are more in Middle East than in the Caribbean. So this position is a strong position, historical position, but it is absolutely normal with a strong, hard debate in the US society and inside the Cuban community. But I think that the president of the US president has taken a new way, political way, for sure, at the end of his mandate, understanding and knowing that he won't have the majority at the Congress, but it is a new way, historical, being based on the interest and mutual interest. It is from the US interest to open a new page with the Cuban relations and for sure for Cuba.
Some people saying, though, that this relationship could be a bit one-sided or not in the interests of ordinary people. Do you think that ordinary people might be victims?
I think that in Cuba you have to rebuild infrastructure for the economy. You have to rebuild financial links with the international institution, with the IFEs. That's all this context. Today we have to establish with Cuba, even if Cuba has many links in the international relations. I mean, Cuba are, for example, linked with all the countries in Latin America. Only in the American continent with the US, the situation was blocked. But Cuba has a professional diplomacy, a very strong diplomacy, and I think that you don't learn to an old monkey to do grimace.
Just looking at the political side of this, obviously we've seen that the embassies have been reinstated symbolically today in Havana and in Washington. But there's still a lot of other issues that need to be cleared up. The biggest of them, the economic sanctions. Havana says this is a blockade on Cuba, and anyone who's visited, it's clear to see how Cuba suffered. Do you see, though, that Barack Obama can clear up this issue of the sanctions easily? We've heard some very, very loud, strong voices there from the likes of Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, saying, let's not tidy this all up straight away.
Yes, that's the point. I mean, at the Congress, the majority today is against those new links and new way with Cuba. And Barack Obama is handing his mandate. So that's really the point. And I mean that today, if the end of the embargo is for sure in the long process on the table, you have other points on the table. I'm thinking about Guantanamo. What will happen with the naval bases, for example, of Guantanamo? What about the compensation with the refugee in the US, for example? So many points will be on discussion and will be strong debates.
Indeed. And just looking more widely in the region, Cuba has had these very strongly anti-American policies that have been quite a rallying point for other countries in Latin America at different times. If Havana's getting friendly with Washington now, where does this leave countries, thinking of Venezuela perhaps in particular, whose government is very strongly anti-American?
Yes, and I think that's also the strategic point For Cuba, it is a vital moment. The links with Venezuela are very strong, but Venezuela is down today economically. And so they had to open new ways, and that's really the point. The Latin America evolution, changing, obliged Cuba to find a new way and to begin this new process.
Indeed, and it begins today, or another phase of it does anyway. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
For now, Pascal
Welcome.
Drouot from the Choiseul Institute here in Paris.